Deep in the heart of the Golden Valley sat the kingdom of Orde, a land famous for its music. In Orde, everything had a sound. The waterfalls hummed in harmony, the wind whistled through the fluted canyons, and even the stones seemed to vibrate with a low, grounding bass. At the center of this symphony lived King Alaric. Alaric was a man of immense presence and a voice like a pipe organ. He loved the sound of his own decrees, the booming echo of his laughter, and the way his subjects fell silent the moment he drew a breath to speak. To Alaric, leadership was the art of being heard. He spent his days giving long, winding speeches from the balcony of his marble palace, convinced that his wisdom was the only thing keeping the valley in tune. He believed that to be a king was to be the lead singer of the world, and everyone else was merely the backup choir. He never noticed that the villagers often looked exhausted by his lectures, or that his young daughter, Princess Ilara, rarely spoke at all because she could never find a gap in her father's wall of sound. One humid Tuesday, a strange shimmering fog rolled off the Sapphire River and settled over the palace. Alaric, standing at his podium to deliver a 3-hour address on the importance of royal tapestry, opened his mouth to begin. He took a deep breath, puffed out his chest, and pushed, but nothing happened. He tried again, coughing and straining until his face turned the color of a ripe plum. Not a squeak, not a whisper, not even the sound of air passing through his teeth emerged. The king had become perfectly, utterly silent. The court physicians were summoned instantly. They poked his throat with silver instruments and brewed teas made of honey and dragon-scale herbs, but the silence remained. The great hall, usually filled with the king's booming commands, became a tomb of hushed whispers and clinking spoons. Alaric was terrified. Without his voice, he felt invisible. He scribbled frantic notes on parchment, demanding a cure. But the more he wrote, the more he realized that no one was really looking at him. They were looking at his letters, and even then they seemed more relieved by the quiet than saddened by his loss. A week into the silence, a withered woman named Old Martha, who lived in the hollow of a great oak, was brought to the palace. She didn't bow, and she didn't look impressed by the gold trim on Alaric's robes. She simply sat on the edge of the king's bed, looked into his panicked eyes, and smiled. "The voice isn't broken, Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves skittering on a path. "It's just hiding. It's tired of being the only thing you hear. If you want to speak again, you must learn to hear the things that have no tongue. Go into your kingdom. When you can tell me what the river is worried about and what the mountain is dreaming of, your voice will return." Alaric was skeptical and angry, but he was also desperate. The next morning, dressed in the simple wool cloak of a traveler to avoid being recognized, the silent king slipped out of the palace gates and headed toward the Sapphire River. For the first 2 days, Alaric was miserable. He sat by the rushing water, tapping his fingers impatiently. To him, the river just sounded like splashing. It was loud, chaotic, and meaningless. He tried to listen by staring intently at the waves, but his mind was too busy rehearsing the angry speech he would give once he could talk again. On the 3rd day, however, the exhaustion of his own thoughts finally took hold. He stopped trying to figure it out and simply closed his eyes. He felt the spray of the water on his face. He felt the vibration of the current against the rock he sat on. Suddenly, the splashing changed. He heard the frantic rhythm of the water hitting a cluster of fallen logs upstream, choking the flow. He heard the river's worry. It was a jagged, stuttering beat, the sound of something trapped. Without thinking, Alaric waded into the cold water. He spent hours heaving the heavy waterlogged branches aside until the water suddenly smoothed out into a long, melodic hum. The river wasn't just splashing, it was singing a song of relief. Alaric felt a strange warmth in his chest, a resonance he had never felt while speaking from his balcony. He moved on to the whispering peaks, the high mountains that guarded the valley. He climbed until the air was thin and the wind was a constant howling roar. Again he waited. He stayed through the night, shivering under the stars. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, the wind died down to a soft sigh. Alaric pressed his ear against the cold gray stone of the summit. He stayed there for hours, perfectly still, until he felt a deep, slow pulse coming from the very heart of the earth. It was a rhythm so slow it took minutes for a single beat to pass. He understood then. The mountain was dreaming of the stars it had watched for 1,000 years. It was a dream of stillness and endurance. Alaric realized that compared to the mountain's dream, his royal decrees were like the buzzing of a mayfly, brief and insignificant. He felt small, but for the first time in his life, he felt connected to the world rather than above it. When Alaric returned to the village at the base of the palace, he didn't head straight for the gates. He walked through the marketplace. Because he couldn't speak, he had to look. He saw a baker sharing a small loaf of bread with a stray dog, their eyes meeting in a silent pact of kindness. He saw two estranged brothers standing at a fruit stall. They didn't speak, but he saw the way one reached out to steady the other's hand as he reached for an apple. He saw the silent songs of his people, the rhythms of grief, the melodies of hard work, and the harmonies of hidden love. He realized that for years he had been a conductor who never listened to his orchestra. He had been so busy being the king of Orde that he had forgotten how to be a part of it. Finally, Alaric returned to the palace. He found old Martha waiting in the throne room, with Princess Ilara sitting quietly by her side. The king didn't go to his throne. He walked straight to his daughter and knelt on the floor so he was at her eye level. He took her hands in his. He didn't try to force a sound. Instead, he looked at her with a focus so intense as if he were seeing her for the first time. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the slight tremble of her chin, and the way she held her breath, waiting for him to take over the room. In that silence, Alaric heard her daughter's song. It was a song of longing to be known, a delicate melody that had been drowned out by his booming voice for years. Tears welled in the king's eyes. He squeezed her hands, a silent apology and a silent promise. The river was worried about the weight it carried, Alaric whispered. His voice was different now. It wasn't a roar or a command. It was soft, weathered, and clear like a bell. And the mountain dreams of the sky's embrace. Old Martha nodded, a knowing glint in her eyes, and quietly slipped out of the room. Ilara gasped, her eyes widening as she heard her father's new voice. But the king didn't launch into a speech about his journey. He didn't call for a celebration or a scribe to record his wisdom. Instead, he sat on the floor with his daughter and said, "Tell me, Ilara, what is your song today? I am ready to listen." The kingdom of Orde changed after that day, though not because of any new laws. It changed because the king spent more time walking the streets than standing on balconies. He became known as the Silent King, not because he couldn't speak, but because he knew when not to. He learned that the most powerful word a leader can utter is often the one they hold back to make room for another's voice. The music of the valley grew richer, more complex, and more beautiful, for it was no longer a solo performance. It was a symphony, where every stone, every river, and every heart had a part to play, led by a king who knew that true wisdom isn't found in the strength of one's lungs, but in the openness of one's ears. Alaric had found his voice by losing it, and in the quiet spaces between words, he finally found his people.